Okay, so we will start with this roundtable on the challenges and solutions towards anti-discrimination assessment of algorithmic tools in the hiring sector, or just in easier terms, how to fight discrimination when AI is involved in recruiting. And I'm very happy to have a great round of panelists actually with us today. I will introduce them in a minute, but before I do so, I will start by giving you a bit of information around FINDHR, who's actually that is actually the research project behind this roundtable. I'm Angela. I'm the Executive Director of Algorithm Watch Switzerland, and I will be moderating this panel today. Okay, so just some information about FINDHR. I think we also have a slide maybe that we can put up, and you also find some information in the chat. FINDHR is a research project. It is funded by the EU Horizon Europe program, and we're 11 partners across Europe from academia, industry, and also civil society. Some of you find today on the panel. And the focus of the project is really on fighting discrimination in algorithmic or AI-assisted recruiting. And we do that by 3 approaches. We develop algorithms, so we work on the technical side of things. We also develop methods, meaning, for example, auditing and impact assessment methods. And then we develop training to train different stakeholders involved in AI-assisted recruiting. And the conviction behind the project is really that it is possible to do something to mitigate discrimination in AI-based hiring. There's probably not the perfect solution, and it's hard to do away with this challenge also completely, but there are really tangible things that all of us involved in AI-based recruiting can do. You can see now also on the screen a slide. This is the QR code to our mailing list. And the mailing list becomes more and more relevant because the project enters its final phase. It closes around the end of this year. So this means this is the phase where research projects start to get interesting also for the outside. And we will be releasing a lot of material and actually research results in the next weeks and months, including toolkits for policymakers, for HR professionals, for software developers, also a lot of training materials and so on. So if you're interested in a topic and in the results, sign up to the mailing list. You find the link here and the QR code here and also in the chat. So after the summer break, when everyone's back to work, we will start disseminating a lot of hopefully really helpful resources. And of course, these are all free to use. Okay, so before I introduce also the panel we have with us today, just maybe some points on format and housekeeping. So the format will be that we will have a main round of like small inputs / presentations from the 4 panelists, around 10 minutes each, so that they can really summarize their perspective. And then we have a short discussion among the panelists to also pick up on others' point and to react maybe on statements of other panelists. And then we open for Q&A for about 15 to 20 minutes. So if you have questions, reflect on them. And you can, of course, also put questions in the chat, but just be aware we will only have like 15 to 20 minutes. So it might be easier if you just ask them directly. But of course, the chat is open to use. And then, I ask panelists to mute yourselves, of course, when others are speaking, but feel free to unmute for the discussion then, so that it's also real discussion and you can react to others. Okay, this means we will move to the first round, the main round of presentations. And I suggest that I just introduce the 4 of you in a row, and then we can just go on. I start with Aida. Aida is a senior researcher at the European Trade Union Institute, ETUI. That's the independent research and training center of the European Trade Union Confederation. So she's really a researcher and focuses on strategic foresight and on regulatory issues around emerging technologies. She's also a member of various expert groups and bodies at the European Commission and at the OECD. And Aida is a lawyer by training and has a PhD in law and a master's degree in bioethics. I'm very happy that you can be with us today. Then next is Nina Baranovska. She's a legal researcher at Radboud University in the Netherlands, and her research focuses on the challenges of AI and digital technologies, with a particular interest in data protection, non-discrimination law, and product liability. And that's also why she is a fantastic fit for a researcher at the FINDHR project, where that she is currently working on. Nina also has a PhD in law. And then Zhangyang He is a postdoc researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Security and Privacy. He employs a human-centered approach to study like how to develop algorithms and to enhance inclusion, connectivity, and well-being for underrepresented groups. He is currently also working for FINDHR on fairness monitoring, and Zhangyang has a PhD in computer science and engineering. Then, last but not least, Ansgar Köhne, who regularly advises policymakers, regulators, industry, NGOs, academia, and others, including FINDHR, to support actually the trustworthy use of AI. Ansgar is Global AI Ethics and Regulatory Lead at EY, and he also has a track record in the field of standardization around AI, so at IEEE and Sensenelec. Ansgar has a multidisciplinary research background and holds a master in electrical engineering and a PhD in computational neuroscience. So you can see we have an outstanding panel here. And without further ado, I would hand over to Aida to open the round of presentations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela, and thank you, everybody. If you don't mind, I will share just a few slides to accompany what I will say. Is that okay?
Sure, sure.
Great. So let me share my slides. Right, so to open this interesting discussion, I will go through some aspects related to the law and how they applied to job seekers and candidates. I will do it in three kind of questions or three guiding themes. The first one will be whether job seekers and candidates are really protected from algorithmic discrimination or from digital discrimination arising from the digital tools that some of them contain AI systems as we define them in EU law, and some of them they don't contain AI systems or they are even mixed. And that's a very difficult question to answer, hence I believe your EU project. But we need to consider the two phases in this type of work relationship, if you like, the recruitment, which concerns the entry into the employment relationship, which is a process that has a lot of phases, but many of them are very much unseen, like the vacancy notice, it's just published when it is outside, when it is really advertised, and then there comes a lot of background checks that sometimes the job seekers or the candidates do not know, testing, interviewing, ranking of candidates finally, and the contract. And with that, a different phase or a different legal situation arises. So as I said before, the use of digital systems, of course, now it's like a baseline for every recruiter or every employer who wants to recruit, and hence we are in the play of many different EU laws and national law. Of course, the data that is collected from the job seeker, it's a lot because there have to be many decisions to be made. The question is how to avoid that a job seeker is not discriminated. And then the other phase of this big process is the recruitment, where the other laws also complement the existing laws, and it is really the contractual relationship with someone who wants to work with the employer. There are different rights that come on top of the non-discrimination and privacy and fundamental rights protection that are embedded into this new relationship with the employer. But now we focus on the previous one, right? So the second question that perhaps we would like to discuss is whether the EU legal framework, whether it be the big macro protections given by the Charter, the regulations and the directives, do achieve a right balance of in the recruitment process. And let me just point out at three very different domains. The quality directives regarding employment and pay transparency and avoiding discrimination. Also the GDPR, together with the opinions of the European Data Protection Supervisor or the European Data Protection Board, and case law concerning specific automated decision-making systems, and of course the AI Act. That also is complemented with national law that we should not omit. But these are the three main areas of law that we would like them to converge. The question is, what is the interrelationship between them? Do they really are built in a way that are like a fitting puzzle, or are there issues in which we don't know how they really apply, or whether their rights are not really exercisable by job seekers or candidates? In my view, I have to say that these three legal domains or legal instruments are complementary. So we have substantive rights, we have other rights that govern the processing of personal data, and some principles that govern the collection and the processing of that. And we have the AI Act, which governs the systems and how they are put into the market. In principle, they are complementary, and especially the GDPR and the AI Act are thought by the legislator to fit in. However, my second point is that even when we could have a theoretical balance in this fitting of principles and rights, the practices themselves, sometimes they don't guarantee the actions of these rights, and often, in some cases, there is discrimination. So, how to address this intersectionality between these three domains? I think that, just to give it as a teaser, there are European principles in law that do need to be actionable, and we have already guidance on that. We have the principle of transparency and fairness in processing and transparency of the systems as well. We have also the necessity and proportionality of the treatment of the information, what data should be collected, how much, how little, for what purposes, in what circumstances. Another principle that is often very much invoked in this situation is minimization, whether it's adequate, relevant, and limited to what is necessary and proportionate. And of course, we have guidelines from the European Data Protection Authorities in order to fine-tune the application of these principles. The context says it all. It's the context of recruitment, and this is when guidance does really need to be adequate for that specific context. And with all this comes the GDPR enforcement. Just as a checkup list, what is the sensitive data to be necessary and proportionate to be collected? Whether the providers or the deployers of AI systems or the employers are really including these type of principles in their tools. There are also technical methods to embed this type of data protection by design and debiasing tools as well. What about the involvement of the impacted people, like job seekers and future employees? And there is also an interesting idea to integrate privacy-preserving technologies with proper AI and data governance. That should be now more or less a build-up practice in every company, because we have the AI slowly coming into force, and of course an effective transparency. So with that, I just wanted to finish as a teaser, and happy to discuss with you in the following steps. Back to you, Angela.
Thanks a lot, Ida, for this first very concise presentation. And then I hand it over to Nina. And I think that is a very good match because Nina will directly also follow up on Ida's presentation. Thank you.
Yes, could you see my screen? It works?
Yes, we can.
Yes, okay. It's always the most stressful in this online presentations when we talk about technology, when the slides doesn't work. So good that everything works. And thank you for joining our webinar. And thank you, Ida, for this great start to the discussion. I would like to present some of the results that we already have in our project. And I must stress that this is a joint effort together with Frederick Zaudenberg-Hessius, Asia Biega, Changkyang Che, who is here and who will present later, Carlos Castillo, and other partners. As Angela presented, in the project, we looked for different tools to detect and mitigate discriminatory bias in AI hiring systems. And I will briefly present what we've been doing so far, and then focus on one of the results, which is post-deployment monitoring, and some challenges, legal challenges and solutions for such monitoring. Just to briefly present and briefly clarify what we understand by algorithmic hiring is the use of AI-based tools for sourcing and assessment of job candidates. And in the project, we even narrow it down and focus mainly on ranking tools. So those systems that they rank candidates according to their estimated fitness for the job. So based on the information, for example, in CVs, in application materials. So we don't analyze, for example, video interviews or tools that screen CVs, but they also exist. Those tools exist on the market. And within only the ranking tools, we look at potential bias and the discrimination. If you are interested, there is an overview survey we published some time ago on fairness and bias in algorithmic hiring. And our project proposes different tools to help prevent and detect discrimination. As Angela said, we are a consortium of partners, and we are also part of the AI fairness cluster with other similar EU-funded projects. And we are now in the final year, and we have prepared different tools that can be implemented on different stages of AI lifecycle. So if you see this a blue graph, this is an AI lifecycle, very basic one. And on different stages in FINDHR, we developed some tools. So for example, we have fairness hour rankings, we have synthetic data set, we have impact assessment, auditing framework for auditors, explainability models, a guide for software developers. So this is a very complex work. The result will be public soon. So that's good that there was a QR code to trace our results. And having this very complex landscape in mind, now I want to talk a little bit more about monitoring discrimination in post-deployment. So in the graph, you see this as a very last part. Post-deployment is the stage when AI system is already placed on the market and operates in real-world conditions. So it means that the system went through development stage with testing, validation, and finally the system operates, for example, in a hiring company. And monitoring the system in this post-deployment is very crucial. And even if the system went through careful design, testing, checking data sets before deployment, it can still discriminate. And to explain that, let's take a look at the possible form of bias in algorithmic systems and sources of bias. So for example, we can have pre-existing bias in data collected from the real world, so in historical data, but we can also have some technical bias that can appear a little bit later, so from how the system was designed. But also we can have emergent bias. So when the tool is used by real users that behave in the kind of let's say, unexpected way that wasn't taken into account while developing a system. And because of that, even if the system was tested before deployment, it can still discriminate, and it still needs to be monitored after it operates on the market. And to monitor the system, we should refer to the current legal framework and the employment sector. We have the EU directives that prohibit discrimination based on 6 protected characteristics. called protected grounds. So we have age, gender, ethnicity, religion, sexual preferences, and disability. There might be more international laws, which is a very complex systems between EU and national laws, but let's stay at the EU level for now. And in the project, we took approach that to effectively monitor the system outcomes, we should know these characteristics of actual candidates who are ranked by the system in a particular job opening. There are other approaches, as Aida mentioned, that do not use directly these characteristics and, for example, instead use estimated data, but they seem to have some limitations. So we took this approach in the project. And of course, in our case, we also are facing some limitations that I will explain now and how we dealt with that. So from the characteristics that are important for non-discrimination law, 4 of them are so-called special categories of personal data under General Data Protection Regulation, so under GDPR. In short, I call it sensitive data just to be shorter. And in principle, GDPR in Article 9 prohibits processing this sensitive data. At the same time, there is a list of special conditions when processing might be allowed. And from the list of exceptions that you can see on the left side, explicit consent might be the one, let's say, of the broadest condition. But again, it's a little bit complicated in the employment sector that is quite specific, because explicit consent to be freely given, to be valid based on GDPR must be also freely given, which means given in a genuine choice, for example, no pressure. And because of the power imbalance between job candidate and the hiring company, consent is quite unlikely to be freely given in many circumstances in the employment context. So that's quite problematic. And with Algorithmic, we don't have any specific exceptions for monitoring discrimination in AI systems, but we have the AI Act. So there is one exception in the AI Act that allows to exceptionally process sensitive personal data, but only when it's strictly necessary, only for bias detection and correction, and only in training, validation, and testing data sets. So when we look at this exception, then it means that it applies only to data sets and the development stage of the AI. And it doesn't cover monitoring the system outcomes when the system operates on the market, so in post-deployment stage. So this exception is quite limited. It sounds broad at the first glance, but it's quite limited only to development stage. And if we need to monitor the system after deployment, this exception doesn't apply in our case. So to overcome these challenges that we have in the project, we've been working on the technical protocol that allows to monitor fairness, and the protocol is based on multi-party computation. From the technical side, the protocol has been developed by Max Planck Institute in Bochum, and my colleague Changkyang will explain you in details how such a monitoring could work. This is a very simple graph for my presentation. Just to give you a brief introduction, that the monitoring is based on 2 parties, and one is a service provider, so for example our hiring company, and the other is a so-called trusted party. This is still a vague word, but what does it mean, trusted third party? In practice, it can be another company, but it can be a trade union, it can be a civil society organization or a research center. And this party in our settings plays a very active role in measuring fairness of the ranking. What is important from the legal perspective is that the job candidate gives consent to process sensitive data to this trusted third party and not to the hiring company. So hiring company at any point shouldn't have access to sensitive data that were disclosed on voluntary basis by the job candidate. And this mechanism this is a very simplified version, but this mechanism has more safeguards that Changkyang will explain. But from the data protection perspective, what is important is that because there is no direct power imbalance between a job applicant and a trusted third party, explicit consent from the job seeker is probably and is more likely to be valid based on GDPR, because we create kind of a better environment for the candidate to share their sensitive data under GDPR. So generally, what we saw in the project, what we see is that, like, first of all, monitoring AI systems after it has been released on the market is an important step still to detect and mitigate potential discrimination. And in current regulatory framework, it's a little bit problematic how to monitor the system results and if and how to process sensitive data of job candidates for such monitoring. Our proposal, our concept of trusted third party might be a solution for monitoring the system outcomes, but of course there are further implementation challenges and limitations. So for example, the open question remains who should be or can be a trusted third party, because then we have to take into account technical capabilities of this entity, infrastructure, political independence, and so. And we probably need more guidance from policymakers to solve this issue. And so far, we don't have those. And I will stop here, and I will pass the floor to my colleague Chang-Yang, who will give you like more insights from the technical side of this protocol. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Nina, for your presentation. Very useful overview. And then I pass the floor to Chang-Yang. And I think you also have some slides to share.
Yes.
Okay. Okay,
Yes.
we can see your slides, yes.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Chang-Yang He, and I'm a postdoc researcher from Max Planck Institute for Security and Privacy. Thank you, Angela, for the general introduction, and thank you, Aida and Nina, for the very comprehensive legal background of the non-discrimination and the post-deployment monitoring part. So my part is more technical about how should we implement the secure multi-party computation for fairness monitoring. As Nina just mentioned, when a monitoring actor wants to monitor the hiring algorithms, whether it's fair or not, we need to access the sensitive data, because when we want to know whether this algorithm is biased or not to some demographic groups, we need to know where at least which this candidate, which groups are they from. So we need to access the sensitive attribute here. However, the data protection laws like GDPR limits the access of sensitive data in the monitoring stage. So here comes the challenge of fairness monitoring under privacy constraints. There are already several privacy preserving techniques for fairness monitoring. So for example, differential privacy generally carefully adding some noise to the data so that the individual's data is confidential is one way to protect the privacy, but it faces a trade-off between privacy and accuracy, especially for the small data set, when the noise added can lead to a huge difference to the final monitoring result. Second way is a synthetic data set, but as Nina just mentioned, the synthetic data set is also based on the real world data set, and it can also be biased at the first hand, and it might not able to capture the real world biases. So we propose a way of multi-party computation. It allows fairness monitoring based on inputs from various parties without any party revealing the value of their input. How does it work? So let's consider a scenario that the job candidate shares their sensitive data after the job application. And in this protocol, in addition to the model owner that operates the hiring algorithm, there's also a trusted third party that helps the management of the whole protocol. So it directly encrypts the sensitive data to 2 secret shares. And in this way, either of the party has just 1 secret share, and none of the party can directly access the the sensitive data to get the sensitive information by their own. And through two-party computation, the fairness matrix can be achieved through secret sharing. Let's consider a simple example. Suppose a candidate shares the sensitive data of gender, and we encode the female as 1, and we use a random variable to create two secret shares by minus the random variable and plus the random variable, and distribute the two secret shares to two parties. And after that, we can virtually reconstruct the sensitive data by adding these two secret shares together, divided by 2. And using that, we can compute the final fairness matrix. And this process is protected by the multi-party computation protocol, so that in this computation process, none of the party can really access the sensitive data. So it's just a virtual reconstructed variable. As the hiring is a very complex ecosystem, so we consider different fairness metrics across different stages, including input fairness that considers diversity among the job candidates pool, and the output fairness focuses on the fair ranking, whether the ranking is fair or not. And the outcome fairness focuses on the final classification, like the interview result or the final hiring result. So, as we just mentioned, there are different limitations of the privacy-preserving techniques. So, what is the multi-party computation the final solution that can be applied to every scenario? Of course, no. So it has some limitations. The first, it has some technical. It requires some technical capacities and requires some necessary infrastructure for the secure two-party communication and the computation. And second, we need to ensure that there is collaboration for multi-party computation, as well as there is independence with commitment to protect candidates' data. So suppose the two parties, they secretly share the secret share to each other, and in that way, they can actually reconstruct the sensitive data, and this is what we don't want. Finally, it's also very important to ensure that candidates have the trust in the entity. So we also have some user studies about that. Yeah, I think that's all of my introduction. So back to you, Angela.
Thanks a lot, Changyang, for the technical side, for presenting the technical side of things. And then we come to our fourth panelist, Ansgar Köhne. And yeah, I hand it over to you. I don't know whether you have slides to share.
Thank you very much. No, I don't have any slides to share. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. So what I want to do is to zoom out perhaps a bit again, taking from these more detailed views that we just got from Nina and from Changyang as to a particular approach to solving the issues around the use of automated systems in hiring, and reflecting back on what is the policy discussions that are currently ongoing, not just in the EU, but also outside. Because obviously, a lot of the types of tools that we're seeing in this space are being produced outside of the EU and being offered to companies in the EU. But also, this whole space is just cross-border activities are happening quite a lot. So first of all, Ida already provided a great introduction to the interaction between various pieces of legislation within the EU, especially GDPR, AI Act, and also Anti-Discrimination. And in that space, I think perhaps just one thing to add on to this is, of course, whereas GDPR is very much focusing on the data privacy aspects around this. And so, for instance, the questions around the collection of sensitive data on participants. Within the AI Act, especially if we look at it from a AI supply chain kind of perspective, those that are producing AI systems and then offering it to HR departments to use, under the AI Act, they have additional obligations to make sure that good risk and quality management procedures are in place as they are producing these systems, and also for those that are going to deploy it. There's also the obligations around clear transparency and information to the deployers. So when a provider creates an AI system with a particular kind of use case in mind, and they've done certain types of tests hopefully that will also be checking whether or not the system is performing in a biased way, they need to provide the deployers with good enough information so that the deployers will understand what is the space within which these tests were valid. You know, if I'm going to deploy this now in a context where perhaps the type of population that we're engaging with, or the types of jobs that we're looking at, have different characteristics than in the original test cases, then you cannot rely on those tests that the original producer made. And there's also an important aspect, an obligation around record keeping. This is, of course, an important aspect when it comes to afterwards checking how has this system, once it is in operation, actually performed. Has it ended up being discriminatory or not? And so the record keeping aspect is also an element within the AI Act where there is still, certainly when it comes to the standards around this, questions, what should be collected, how should it be collected, how do we manage these? And I think the types of technical solutions that Chengyang spoke about can become an important element within this. How do we do the record keeping without violating GDPR concerns? How do you balance record keeping for checking that the system operates with data minimization obligations under the AI Act? But as I said, I also want to, zoom out a little bit outside of the EU, and some may think that the EU is the one that is, the primary one doing any kind of regulation in this space, and that perhaps the US is not looking at this at all. While it is true that the US has not passed any federal legislation around the use of AI systems, we do see at various state levels that, especially in a space like hiring questions, that a number of states, California, Colorado, Illinois, Maryland, and within New York, also the New York City, have actually passed legislation specifically around concerns with regards to discrimination on the grounds of these protected characteristics in the hiring space. And the New York City one is an interesting one in the sense that it was one of the earlier ones that came forward and included an obligation, and it still includes it, includes an obligation that the hiring systems need to be audited to check that they are not biased prior to being taken into use. But this is also an area where some of the potential problems have come to the fore, which is that there was not sufficient clarity as to what does a good audit actually look like, and who should be doing it. The issue, Chengyang already mentioned it, around independence within your proposed solution, but also then in the auditing kind of space, a question about independence. You can't have a party that provided consultation around putting in place this algorithm, then also be the one that does the assessment of whether it is biased. But then if you're saying independent third-party assessment, how do we make sure that the different assessors will actually check for the same kind of things, that we get comparable kind of assessment results, and that the reports of these assessments can be sufficiently interpreted? And so that's one of the areas, for instance, where then standards created by recognized standardization bodies become an important reference point, so that everybody can say, well, we did this assessment on the basis of this standard. And of course, the EU AI Act, bringing it back to the EU, is, of course, a piece of legislation that is also strongly relating to the use of technology standards for defining what does a good risk management process look like, what does a good data governance process look like, what is good record keeping, etc. The standardization exercise is a challenging one, and perhaps that is also something that is worthwhile bringing into the conversation, is the need to have all of the stakeholders that are impacted in this space be part of the creation of these standards, because it is, this is a space that is typically dominated by those that are creating technology. But of course, if we're thinking about something like the use of AI algorithms in hiring, the stakeholders are not just the technology developers. The stakeholders are everybody who is a potential employee, which is basically everybody. So we need people who are thinking more in these kinds of social, societal contexts, and that can bring that lens into the standardization space to create what does good look like in this space. And that has proven to be challenging for various reasons, but it is something that is being worked on. So it's good to reflect on that. But again, just before finalizing here, I do want to point out that while this is work that is happening at the European level, in that case at CENSENELEC, there's also important standardization work happening outside of the EU. NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology in the US, created a risk management framework, which has become an important reference point. Singapore has a strong initiative around assessment of AI systems, some of which can be assessments of AI systems in hiring in their AI Verify Foundation. And of course, a lot of the European standardization work, CENSENELEC, is also referencing international standards such as ISO standards, ISO IEC standards, just to highlight that this is an area where there is effectively global interest, and there's also a need for multi-stakeholder participation at a global kind of scale. It's a new challenge. Just the last couple of weeks at UN conferences, IGF and World Summit Information Society, we have seen the UN recognizing this and trying to work towards this. But there's still quite a lot of work to be done for these processes to be truly inclusive. And with that, I'll hand over to Angela for us to get to the next round.
Thanks a lot, Ansgar, for adding your perspective to this. So this was the first overview of very helpful presentations into the topic. I assume like the audience is kind of is diverse and comes from different backgrounds and perspectives. So let me also in this discussion part that we now have, let me also dig into some aspects that you have already mentioned, but maybe we'll need some more explanation. And the first is mostly goes to Aida and to Nina. You both mentioned like this dilemma, right, between protecting sensitive data, which is important in this respect, and then also the need actually to have access to sensitive data in order to be able to monitor systems for discrimination. Still, I mean, you proposed several solutions around it, or a solution around it, but let me come back to this. Is this, in your view, is it a real dilemma? So is there a real trade-off involved? Will we just have to decide? Or is it something that you think can really be resolved? Maybe Nina, you go first, because you were the second in the presentation row, and then Aida can directly also react to what Nina said.
Yes, thank you for this question. And I think there is a dilemma, especially when we think about the data protection law in Europe, which is quite strong, and we have GDPR with certain requirements. And maybe it's not the perfect legislation, and putting everything based on consent or legitimate interest, there are some critiques over that. And I think I see this tension with privacy and data protection and non-discrimination, and also tension between computer scientists who would like to measure fairness and they need a lot of data, and then, hey, okay, let's step back. We have those regulations here, and you cannot get access to this data unless you ABCD meet some requirements. So I still I think that there is a dilemma. That's why we were trying to propose some solutions that will be legally compliant and to make it the best as we can and the most accurate at the same time with trusted third-party computation. Probably there are other solutions. So there's but as Changkyang said, there is a matter of accuracy with other solutions, technical solutions that they don't use, for example, sensitive data directly. So I also think that this trade-off and this tension, maybe sometimes it's good because it's really push forward technical aspects and push tech people to think about other solutions that might be possible, for example, to measure fairness with limited data. So I think having some legal constraints is also that we can see as something positive in that sense.
Okay, thank you. Aida, do you want to directly?
Well, just to pick up in two controversial points. The first thing is that sensitive data is prohibited because of a very strong reason, and this is why the legislature has done so. It's very collecting and processing it. It's very intrusive, and it does violate fundamental rights of everybody: dignity, intimacy, and integrity, and many others. Which are in the charter. So that's really, really fundamental to keep those rights respected. And that's why they have categorized them as very sensitive, because of the level of the intrusiveness and the incapacity of data subjects sometimes to say, well, sorry, but it's too much on me. And concerning about this legitimate valid legal basis to collect and process, I would like to come back just to the most controversial one, which Nina has pointed out, which is informed consent. And on that, it's not even controversial. It's very clear now from GDPR and also from the data protection authorities, European and in the national, in Europe, who have stated that consent is not at all a legal basis in order to collect personal data or sensitive data from workers. We can read as well job seekers as in this one. Why? Again, it's the same rationale. We have an information asymmetry and a power asymmetry that cannot be leveled with many things. So it naturally employers or recruiters or any organization who's deploying an AI system to extract information from that data subject who wants to apply for a job or who is in a job relationship is naturally in a subordinated relationship. And this is why with consent we cannot allow that to happen. So very quickly on that, and back to you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Nina, you said in your reply that this is also good, and it brings tech people also to reflect on what they can do. But maybe it's a question to all of you, maybe especially to Changkyang, but I think to all of you, it would be interesting to hear your thoughts. Like, is this then something like the discrimination that is happening through AI-assisted hiring? Is this something we can solve at the technical level? Because of course you now presented like a very particular approach. I know that of course it is a piece of the puzzle, but do you think this is really we should focus on the technical level, or if not, what else is needed?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So actually, in my opinion, this discrimination can happen in a very complex way because the hiring is generally situated in a very complex socio-technical system. So maybe we can consider a very simple scenario that so the hiring company only choose the number one candidate in the hiring algorithm as the one for future evaluation, like interviews and some other steps. If in this scenario, that influence how we develop the hiring algorithm and how we ensure the fairness. Because in this system, maybe when the system can generate we can measure fairness in top 20, but when the interaction between the hiring algorithm and the hiring company actually leads to some additional layer of the discrimination, it can be much more complex that a purely algorithm cannot solve. So I think it's a process that both the tool itself can lead to discrimination, and also the interactions in every stage, especially how does the hiring company use this tool. So yeah, there are different sources of discrimination, and it's not only the problem of the algorithm itself.
Mm-hmm. Ansgar.
Yeah, I think maybe it's useful to reflect on sort of an extreme kind of case to highlight the extent to which possible discrimination in hiring is not purely down to the algorithm. I think pretty much everybody can imagine and may or may not have experienced in their life also cases where positions get announced, but really there's already a clear idea of the person that they want to hire. And effectively, what you get is that the requirements for the position get very clearly shaped so that this will be pretty much the only person that qualifies for the position. So this is just sort of the extreme of, you can, of course, lead to discrimination by the way in which you shape the candidate requirements. And so that means there's a need for sufficient transparency about this, and a need for the ability for that to become challenged. That is difficult, because how can you argue that the requirements for the position needed to be different if you weren't part of the team, you didn't fully understand what the position is going to be? But this is just to highlight that there are other avenues. If one really wants to be discriminatory, one can still achieve that, probably even with the best kind of algorithm that you're trying to put in place when it comes to the final evaluation of the candidates against those criteria that are put in place. Nevertheless, it is important, this kind of work around how to address the actual algorithms. And I think one of the elements there is also the fact that especially if we're using algorithms that use machine learning to learn, for instance, from past candidates' profiles, etc., to identify what the good profile is, the risk that you are building in discrimination on base of these protected characteristics without intending to do so, that secondary characteristics get combined in a way that you end up actually still discriminating on the basis of a protected characteristic. And these are kinds of things that we need technical community to look into. How can we get the right kind of transparency as to what it is that the algorithm's actually doing, or the right kind of testing that will surface what it is that the algorithm has actually been doing. So it's important, this work around the algorithms, but we must never fall into the trap of thinking we can do a purely technical solution here, and that will guarantee fair hiring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really interesting perspective. Maybe just to follow up on this, Changyang, do you think like this translation in a way between the legal requirements, the ethical requirements, and then the technical side of things, the software development and so on, is this actually working? I mean, in a research project and in a research setting, I think, some conditions are optimized, and you, of course, work closely with people from various disciplines and perspectives. But like in real world environments, in the companies developing tools and so on, how how is this translation possible, or do you think it is possible?
Yeah, translating the legal perspective into the technical part is always a very challenging task, first of all. And yeah, I mean, I think it's a very good starting point, but it requires much collaboration to like discuss what's the real, like the practical ways of technical implementation. So, for example, I still remember that when I first discussed with Nina about how do we define the sensitive data, actually we have really different definitions of sensitive data, this term itself. So from a legal perspective and from a technical perspective, we do have different definitions in our own area. So that means actually only from one area you cannot really, like from a technical area, you cannot really turn all of these legal requirements into very practical implementation of fair hiring algorithms in a very like the law compliant way. So it requires much collaboration to achieve this fundamental goal. But yeah, it's of course a very challenging task to me.
Okay, thank you. But of course, now we're interested in hearing the other side. Nina, what do you think? Like, what is your experience? Maybe that's as a first part, and then as a second part, you might also want to come back to my earlier question on, is it the technical solution only, or what else is actually needed in this complex, actually, ecosystem of hiring that you showed on your slide?
First of all, it's a complex ecosystem in hiring and complex issues related to the non-discrimination law. And when you think about the non-discrimination, it's very context specific. It's very contextual. When we talk about indirect discrimination, that can be in some cases justified. So we don't have discrimination at the end, depending on the proportionality test and all these requirements of non-discrimination, also taking into account case-by-case law in the countries. I think it's very hard to put that into numerical technical solutions and to have one fairness metrics that will magically solve the problem. I think it's not the case. That's why it's like a very complex process of preventing discrimination on different stages of the AI lifecycle, of interdisciplinary groups, having these conversations, these debates. After working in the interdisciplinary project, I know why other like tech people don't like lawyers, because we usually answer it depends for very basic questions, but this is how the law is described. So it really depends on the context, it really depends on the system, it really depends on A, B, C, D, and other conditions to give the proper answers. And then on top of that, we also have judicial decisions that sometimes even for the lawyers are not logic at the end, or there are controversials. So I think this is a very complex process, and also what we've been trying to do in FINDHR is to propose some technical solutions, because without technical solutions we will not move forward, and I think we will just get paralyzed and we will say, oh, it's complicated and we cannot do that. So we try to propose something. Of course, there won't be any perfect solutions. I think this is like an ongoing work, as Ansgar also said, about AI literacy, about training of deployers, like how they can use those systems. So it's like it's ongoing work, and it should be like a collaborative effort between developers, deployers, different disciplines, and also even if we have technical solutions to detect or mitigate discriminatory bias, someone has to assess that, and someone has to interpret the results, and then finally make the final decision. So Ansgar said about having the offer that is designed for one candidate, but also we can go at the end of the hiring process, and even if we have perfect ranking system, like everything work perfectly. At the end, there's a human decision at the end, and the decision of the HR person, the manager, director, who will, from the list of 1 to 10, a very balanced list and non-discriminatory, will pick up a person depending on, for example, gender, let's say, or personal preferences. So I think this is like a very ongoing process. It's complicated to translate this technical legal requirements to technical measures. That's why we need the interdisciplinary approach to mitigate that.
Okay, thank you. So Aida and Ansgar, you both mentioned that it's really important to take different perspectives into account, also when developing guidelines, when developing regulation and governance. But how to ensure that? I mean, Ansgar, you're involved in standardization, and you said a little bit about how difficult that is. Maybe you can elaborate a bit on that. And Aida, you also mentioned, that there are very difficult also trade-offs between perhaps privacy and non-discrimination, that there are various laws involved with different purposes and so on. So these are like a lot of difficult decisions also behind. How in this complex decision can we really take into account the perspective of those affected by the systems, job seekers, workers, and so on, and how does that work in practice? Who wants to go first? Ansgar?
I'm happy to start, yes. So one of the big challenges, of course, when it comes to saying we want to have an inclusive process is how do we make sure that all of the relevant stakeholders even know that there is a process that they're supposed to be participating in. Governments have been struggling with this for ages when they do a public consultation. Only weird policy people look at public consultation pages to know that this is out there. And a similar thing is true with standardization. Standardization is quite a niche space. Generally speaking, nobody thinks about standards or even knows how this process works. We've seen some initiatives being started to try to remedy this kind of situation. The UK was one of the first to move with creation of the UK Standards Hub, especially for AI, which is trying to raise greater awareness, particularly in academia and among SMEs. I'm not sure how they're trying to reach out to civil society organizations exactly, but it remains problematic. And I'll get to the core of the problem in just a second. Standardization, various standardization bodies operate slightly differently, but at the core, they are all, in principle, open to pretty much everybody participating. There's a certain group of standards that are industry-led and that aren't open, but those tend not to be dealing with these kinds of standards that relate to regulations or legislation. But the problem is, even though it is in principle open for everybody to participate, you don't get any compensation for participating in it. If you're an academic, you tend not to get any academic credit for doing standardization, and it doesn't lead to a publication, so it's not really good for your academic career. If you're in an SME or in a civil society organization, you're going to need to spend time doing the standardization work, which is time that you're not spending doing your other work that would lead to the main developments of what your organization is supposed to do. So really the only participants, intended participants for standardization who have a direct, easy way to charge for their time are the big companies, because they could say, well, this is directly related to our ability to do business in this space. And so they can, make the argument why they should be paying somebody to do this. That's really a key element within standardization as to why we're not getting enough participants. And we have had in the European standardization space, because there's a lot of effort being made to try to attract more participation from non-business people or from SMEs. There is some EU money to help, pay for people's time on this. It's not that much money. It's you have to bid for it, etc. It's quite you have to be quite motivated to even go for this. There's issue. ATRUC is doing a newsletter to provide greater information about what's going on. Again, you need to be somebody who's already thinking about this to even be looking at it. So within standardization, the problem is it's a niche space, and how do you get people to even think and to consider that this is a worthwhile space to involve? Within academia, there is hopefully a possibility to maybe make a participation in standardization become something where you can get actual academic credit for. Link it to research funding processes and those kinds of things. This is where we see one of the biggest challenges. And of course, the challenge of how do you reach out to the community that are these stakeholders is something that isn't not only a problem for standardization, it's for any kind of an initiative we're trying to get participation. Some areas, like in the medical space, there are patient groups that is an established kind of forum that works, but that's because you've got a group that is already shaped into, well, we can easily go to these people. We have a way of accessing them. How do you do that with other things? That's probably where there's a need for the civil society area to bring in the ideas, because they're the ones that have the most experience with doing this.
Thank you. Aida, what is your perspective on this?
Yeah, I have 2 points of view. Well, 2 contributions, if you like. The one on standardization, just to follow up what the practical experience of ACNAR has brought to us. Yes, indeed. So, do you see, for example, it's a stakeholder, a societal stakeholder who is recognized. It's in Sensenelec, and they are participating in some standards, not in everything. However, I have to signal that there are different types of participants or members of these working groups in standards. The ones who are fully recognized with voting rights, and those who are not having those voting rights. And in this case, the ETUC plus SME United, the ones who are representing the SMEs, environmental NGOs and consumer NGOs do not have voting rights. So that's a caveat in participating. Yes, Sensenelec has a regulation opening the doors for having these 3-4 organizations to be in the process, but they cannot vote, they can comment, the input can be taken into account, but at the end, the voting is taken by consensus, and the consensus of whom? Of the majority. So this is where the playing cards become a little bit rougher to deal with. Another point that I would like to take is, well, yes, on the involvement of those who are affected, in this case, the candidates or job seekers. We haven't really talked about them because there is very little space in order for them to be into the verification of the process. They just apply, right? They just want to have a job. There is no mention of at all in the AI Act about whether they should have certain level of AI literacy in a way. There is no mention on whether how can they verify that a recruitment process has been fair, or whether how can they verify that they haven't been discriminated. So that is a missing step in not only in the law, but in the whole of the governance of this entry to the employment. It has never been there. And the AI Act hasn't solved it. I don't think it will. It's the task for the AI Act to solve it. I don't think that the standards will solve it either, because it's a very socio-technical problem that part is still open and lacking. There is a space there that has to be resolved. How can we take them into account? I don't have a full answer for that. There are many ways to embed not only their point of view or to bring them into the design of that system, but also maybe to contest a decision, if any. But how can they know anyways if they have been discriminated? That's the point. That's my major question that I would like to just send out to the community, to the virtual community, because we should have to start thinking about that. All the tools are interesting, whether they're manual or automated tools, but at the end, how do we give them voice and power to those who are being selected or not?
Okay, thanks. That's a really good call. And also a great mention of the virtual community is also participating in the webinar, because feel free to really put your questions or also your comments and inputs in the Q&A section that you should all see in your Zoom. So yeah, just feel free to write down what you would like to hear about more from participants, and you can either direct it at the specific panelist or just ask general questions. In the meantime, I have something to follow up, and I think it's very good what you put out there, maybe just to zoom in a little bit on the proposal presented by Nina and Changyang on the protocol, and then let's zoom out again and see, you know, what can actually policymakers do. But before we can, or before we discuss this, maybe Nina and Changyang, I mean, you both talked briefly about the protocol, but I must say it's a quite complex idea and approach, a very interesting one. But can you maybe quickly say some more words about how it's actually going to function, and especially, I think one of you mentioned it in the presentation, you know, how can organizations, or how could organizations make use of such an approach that are not, I don't know, huge companies with all the resources and technical resources available to actually do that kind of work. So for example, SMEs, or, you know, that still want to use AI-assisted hiring tools, still want to, you know, contribute to reducing discrimination. Is this also something they can do with existing resources, or do you need a lot of technical expertise also on your side to actually implement such a protocol? I don't know who wants to go first, Changyang.
I can go first. Yeah, I really agree that the protocol we propose is quite technically complex. So that means both the trusted third party that we are going to involve in the computation requires the basic infrastructure to like communicate with the model owner, namely the hiring company, to like for some data sharing and the data reconstruction for the fairness metrics. And also it needs to operate the data collection stage that directly interact with the candidates. So these stages all require the basic infrastructure of the technical capacities. So yeah, that's the initial maybe the biggest challenge of this protocol. And actually it has some other underlying things. For example, when the protocol needs to collect users' data, and actually different users have different attitude towards the data sharing, and maybe it's possible that different users, they have different willingness and different proportion of the final data set. So that might lead to a problem that the measurement based on the shared data set might be not really accurate. That only reflects the monitoring result for like partial of the candidate pool. So we also need to ensure that this technical protocol is can deal with these problems. For example, when there are imbalanced data sharing from candidate, how should we promote the accuracy of the final monitoring result? So yeah, these are all important questions to the real world implementation of the protocol. But in general, it offers a way of the data protection, compliant fairness monitoring. But in real world implementation, it needs collaboration and discussion between different stakeholders to propose a real world practical as a software or like the protocol solutions in the real world. Yeah, that's my perspective.
Nina, you want to add to that?
Yeah, so as a lawyer, maybe now I will sound a little bit optimistic, but maybe too optimistic. But I think how public authorities will react, it also matter in the future. Like, for example, based on the AI Act, I think next year there should be published a template on post-market monitoring, like, so what should be covered under post-market monitoring by the European Commission. And then I think we need some like feedback or input from policymakers in that sense, like, so this protocol can be implemented. So I would expect, that's my optimistic side, but I would expect some further steps from, for example, from European Data Protection Board. European Data Protection Board already in some of their guidelines, they recognize multi-party computation as a secure way of exchanging data. It was in a totally different settings about data sharing between countries, but at least these technical tools are recognized and they are promising. So I think it's still evolving area, and research projects like that. I think the idea is to propose something that should catch attention from people who are more decisive. On the other hand, maybe like for smaller companies that they would like to use AI hiring tools, maybe if they see how many requirements they should meet, maybe that would be the decision to drop out, like not to use AI system because it's like so complicated. And I think that would be like more deterrence result at the end. And I think it's also in one of our deliverables, we also like put emphasis on that before you really want to implement the AI system. Like, please make sure if you really need those systems in your organization, that should be the starting point. If you cannot meet some requirements based on the AI Act, or if you don't have a knowledge, if you don't have an infrastructure, maybe it's not a good idea to go there. So I think that should be the starting point. But I would expect like some moves from a movement from policymakers in that sense to give a green light or to give a push or to be recognized, to increase the awareness and knowledge about such technical tools. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So people are still invited to ask questions in the chat. If you don't, then we will just continue to talk because I think there are still many aspects left. I now see one question in the chat. Ria asks whether the EU anti-discrimination law is based on 6 protected grounds that can lead to discrimination. Do you think it is important in terms of refining implementation that new policy or regulation or standardization captures the intersectional dimension of discrimination? Not everyone is aware of what intersectional means in this context. So really maybe you can also explain a little bit about the challenge of intersectional discrimination and why it is so important to meet this challenge. Who wants to jump in? And really you can also jump in if you have points to add.
Maybe I can start with intersectional discrimination, like generally. So like non-discrimination law is traditionally based on single protected characteristics. So we have gender, ethnicity, religion, and sexual orientation, and this is like based on this one single protected characteristics. Intersectionality happens when we have two or more characteristics that become inseparable, and then we can talk about intersectional discrimination. So intersectional discrimination can affect, for example, ethnic minority women, or older women, or disabled gay people, or gay people with ethnic background. So there is always like two or more protected characteristics, and they are inseparable. This creates very specific synergy, and those people can be discriminated. And because of non-discrimination law is based on single protected ground, in some cases, people that are facing intersectional discrimination, they are invisible for non-discrimination law. And now with the AI systems, I think this is even more burning problem, because AI can make many correlations. So I guess the synergy between different characteristics is even stronger. When we think about like generally legal frameworks, in Europe, intersectional discrimination is not fully recognized. I mean, we still have this very traditional approach. There is a resolution of the European Parliament. In some countries, I saw some cases when it was recognized, but with very limited and very specific circumstances. So in general, this concept is not well developed. On the other hand, some scholars think or argue that even without changing the law, it will be still possible to protect people against intersectional discrimination by changing the interpretation of law. So that's one of the arguments. But I think like having some changes in law and make it explicit, I think it will be a good movement also for judges. And then right now, even at the European level, so European Court of Justice in some judgments just denied intersectional discrimination. So I think having this written in the law would be a good movement to raise this problem, which is a burning problem, which is an already quite old problem, but still not very well solved or guided.
Okay, thanks a lot. We have one more question in the chat, we have some minutes left, but not too many. So I would ask you to maybe be brief about this one, because I want to do a short, like, final round, also asking you about, what should the one thing that policymakers should now do, or one of the things that you think is really important. But first, to this question. The question in the chat is, do you think there is a trade-off between fairness and accuracy? We have talked a little bit about the trade-off between data protection and non-discrimination, but is there also a trade-off between fairness and accuracy? Zhang, you've mentioned it also in your presentation. Do you or also Aida have something to add there?
Yeah, that's a very great point. Yeah. Technically, there is indeed a trade-off between fairness and accuracy, and actually in a survey that we want to investigate users' perceptions of a fair hiring algorithm, actually different users perceive the fairness in a different way, and some users just appreciate the general performance of the hiring algorithm, and some people might favor the group fairness or individual fairness. So, and actually their background, for example, their demographics also influence their perceptions of how this algorithm should be designed. So yeah, indeed, there is some trade-off between fairness and accuracy, but it doesn't mean that a fair algorithm have to sacrifice the accuracy. So there are some ways that we can balance these two concepts in general, but yeah, that's a general goal that algorithm developers are working on.
Okay, thank you. Aida, do you want to add to this, or?
Just very quickly, that's a very difficult question, because fairness traditionally comes from very ancient disciplines of law. When law was created, law ethics was created. I mean, the main principle that was in the head of those big philosophers was the idea of fairness in a modern world is justice. So fairness, it's an ethical principle. It's a philosophical concept. Now, it's very difficult to operationalize that philosophical concept into something really practical. How do you translate the philosophy into a practical tool? So that has been really the complexity of the topic. We understand as philosophers, as lawyers, fairness very well in terms of rules and perhaps ethical principles, moral principles, do's and nots and exceptions. All these in theory, in legal practice, is more or less well understood. But it comes when technicalities that fairness needs to take a very different shape. And this is where it becomes tricky. We don't have yet anything to tell us this is practical fairness, not even the AI Act, not the GDPR, not national laws. And accuracy on the contrast, it's not a philosophical concept, it's a technical concept. So we have to look at them from an ontological perspective too, taking into account that accuracy is more related to an accurate decision or an accurate system, perhaps, while fairness is related to whether there has been an equitable action. Very big. Sorry, it's a big question, and maybe others want to pitch on it as well.
Since we only have 3 minutes left, Ansgar, add to that, and then also follow up with my very last question, just like one sentence. What should policymakers focus on right now?
Yeah, so first my add-on to the fairness accuracy. In the context of hiring, I think if you've got a big fairness problem while you are presumably accurate, then we've got a problem with your description of your candidates, your accuracy target, because of course accurate in this case means the right person for the job. So have you defined the right person in a unfair way? Is that why you've got a fairness accuracy mismatch? I think when it comes to policymakers, the biggest challenge at the moment is really it's around the implementation side. We need, and especially in Europe, we need to show that regulation of these types of technologies can be practically implemented in a good way. If we can show that a good implementation of the AI Act is possible, then that opens up also the space for future regulations, and it makes it that the rest of the world is going to say, yes, this is something worthwhile following. If we fail on the implementation, it will strengthen the voices that claim that this is something that cannot be regulated, which to my mind it's a nonsense argument, but vested interests. So it's all about the implementation, and that means put in the resources. National authorities need to have the resources to be able to get staffed. But also we need the resources to be able to bring in the broader community of stakeholders into these things, getting them into the advisory boards for these things to be able to help with providing the good guidance, and of course also contributing to the standards. But it's really the bigger picture. We need enough resources to be provided in order to get the implementation right.
Okay, thank you. Nina, one sentence to end this. What do we need from policymakers?
I would say implementation and enforcement. We still have problems with enforcement with GDPR, and now we have another act on top of that. So, yes.
Zhang Yang?
Yeah, the enforcement and the translation from legal to technical, I mean, that's the biggest problem at the current stage to me.
Aida, final word?
Better law design all the way from the beginning. Then if that happens, implementation is easier.
Okay. Thanks a lot to all of you for these great insights, for your presentations, but also now for the discussion. Thanks to the participants, also for the interesting questions. I put it again in the chat. The FINDHR project is, approaching its end, and we will be releasing, after you get back from your summer break, a lot of material, including 3 toolkits for policymakers, for HR professionals, and for software developers, but also training material, courses, and so on, that hopefully people can make use of, and a lot of stakeholders involved in hiring can make use of. So join the mailing list, because then it's the most direct way to get access to these resources as soon as they are out. And then, yes, slides can be sent around. That was also asked in the chat. And yeah, let's stay in touch and keep this discussion ongoing. Thanks a lot to everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank
Bye.
you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Everyone.
Thank you.